And we're live with our 153rd episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on Twitter, joined by my co-host Seth Law at Seth Law on Twitter. Seth, say hi.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode. Honestly, I was thinking about it earlier today, Ken. I don't know if when we started this, if we thought we would ever get past, 20 episodes, much less 150. But it does feel like things are rolling right along. Life and business is really busy right now, and community is booming. There's a lot of good research that's coming out. I know we haven't had as many guests on over the last month or so. I think that's partially just due to the fact that Ken and I have been super busy and we just haven't been scheduling people. But we will be getting on that, especially in the new year, pulling other industry people back into it. But if you have someone or you would like to come on the show, please reach out. We're always interested in different viewpoints, different guests. It's not just Ken and I that talk about this stuff or are opinionated about it. Obviously, there's a lot of us that are out there that can have that discussion. Outside of that, B-Side Salt Lake City is this week. It starts, it's Friday, Saturday. I will be there. I will have some Absolute AppSec swag. We have to do a refresh because we gave everything away, I'm pretty sure, Ken. So it's time to find some new t-shirts and to get some new stickers and things like that. I think stickers is all I have left on my side.
I've got some of these shirts left cool. If anybody wants them. So you can email info@absoluteappsec.com. That's info@absoluteappsec.com.
Yeah, we'll get them out to you.
So I needed address and t-shirt size, by the way. People don't send me the t-shirt size and then I have to follow up. So just send that with.
Just send that with. You just have to dox yourself. That's all. We just ask that you do it in an appropriate manner. Let's see. Outside of that, we've got quite a few articles to cover today. There's a few things that were on my radar that have been, coming across the news. And but I think, Ken, you wanted to start with that fuzzing tool. So let's jump into that before we get into other things.
Yeah, there's actually there's a second article too, which I shared in another Slack that we're a part of, which is so two things to follow up on. I just thought about this. So the first is like our request smuggling conversation the last couple episodes, and just testing microservices / not just microservices, but like just service oriented architectures in general. But anyways, the second thing will be about breaches. Actually, we talked about breaches last week and breach fatigue and breach information and stuff like that. So I have another interesting article, I think. But let me find the one that sorry, Slack goes super slow when I'm running video chat. So it's taking me a moment to load this, but we have a link here. It's pretty cool. A new fuzzing tool for request smuggling that was released. Okay, I got it. And there you go.
Cool.
And let me
T-Rex.
I'll put it in
fuzzer.
Exactly. So it's basically, a way to safely fuzz for these vulnerabilities. I don't know how much there is to cover. I know it had been picked up by, I think the Daily Swig picked it up and talked about the tool. But yeah, it's a grammar fed fuzzer basically, and generates request smuggling payloads. So anyways, I figured that'd be something cool to share. I don't have a ton to go over with it. It's a Python app, and I think you should check it out. I think it's pretty cool to have something like this. So
well, yeah. So this is one thing actually that I've struggled with in the past when I'm using something like Redamsa or replaying attacks against HTTP servers in and of itself, is that they're not HTTP aware, right? The fuzzers in and of themselves. So, this is definitely a need that we've had for a while, is the ability to target specific components of the HTTP request rather than just, hey, take that whole request and fuzz it, right? Like, So modifying different components has different effects. And so having something that's a little smarter than the DAMSA will just make our life easier. That's basically what it boils down to, because I'll be able to actually target the different components, right? Like we start talking about the layers that go into an HTTP request, which happens all at layer 7. But if you're replaying, network packets, all you're doing is you're manipulating the TCP stack as well, which can have other consequences, right? It ends up you could end up attacking the HTTP server instead of the application. You want to be very targeted in those attacks to figure out where exactly the problems are. So I take a look at it. I mean, this one's on my list to play with because we do quite a few assessments of kind of low level components at times in those microservice environments. So this should be a good tool to have in your back pocket, along with the other stuff that we've talked about in the past. Mm-hmm. I don't know, Ken, have you installed it or played with it yet, or just found it?
Just found it. No, it seems interesting. I think what I like about it is it's focused on, if you look at the verbiage around the tool, it focuses on how there's a mismatch or disagreement. And that's probably the most elegant way to describe it. These vulnerabilities are a disagreement between how components of a request should be parsed and handled. And that occurs between front end and back end services. So I know I like, this is the third episode now where I feel like a broken record, but it's an increasing issue, and it's nice to see sort of, tools written around this. It's not meant to be a pen test tool. They're pretty obviously clear about that. It's not necessarily a pen test tool. It's just sort of trying to figure out if there's a mismatch and disagreement. So it's pretty cool. I'm not sure that.
I love that. So, a few years ago, like I gave that talk, like the whole sputter talk, the whole sputter idea. And that was, we're looking for like indicators of security vulnerabilities, not necessarily trying to exploit or find the vulnerabilities completely. And we want to do that in a quick and concise manner. And this fits right into that vein, right? Rather than, hey, we're going to try and create a pen test tool that does all these things and compromises people and, can be used in nefarious purposes. Putting something like this in your pipeline when you're testing your web services means that when there are problems, they bubble up quickly, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be fully exploitable. But there's no reason that you have to jump down that path to fully exploitable, because there's a problem, let's go and fix it, rather than beating a dead horse. And it's kind of that trade-off of, hey, guess what? We really fill a QA role as penetration testers, security QA, but we don't really need to exploit everything to the umpteenth degree to prove that there's a problem or a security issue with it. So
the team has a few interesting thoughts, which again echo. I'm sharing this because it echoes the sentiment I've been raising. And so just to clarify, the team is our researchers from Northeastern University and Akamai.
Okay.
But the notable quote, let me just read it. So, secure components do not necessarily make a secure system. Security is an emergent property of the system as a whole, which let's just dissecting that, just because you've got securely written apps. This is the point I was trying to make the last couple of weeks, which is just because the individual services have been secured and maybe some of the infrastructure has been looked at, it doesn't mean that when you take that as a whole and requests pass through each of these systems, that there isn't going to be something that is just buggy edge case style behavior that introduces a security vulnerability, which is what a lot of this is. So in the next two sentences, they also say researchers did not traditionally view security from this lens. That is changing and this is really important, this is changing with recently popularized attacks like smuggling, cache poisoning, and cache deception. Does this sound like anything that I said before, Seth? Does this not sound exactly like the thing? Yeah, exactly. This is the point. These new and let me continue with that. They say my team strongly believes that a systems-centric view is key to thwarting the next generation of web attacks. the next generation of web attacks, and therefore we are actively studying this domain. Great, good. That is what we want. This is, again, I know this is an emergent area. I think you and I, we've seen this, and it's good to see it being acknowledged by and pursued by the academic community, as well as a corporate entity like Akamai. I'm sure they deal with that pretty heavily. But anyways, it's just maybe it's validating some I don't know. Is there a validation bias or something? But that's what it feels like. They're validating some thoughts.
That's the reason Ken brought it to the podcast today.
Yeah,
we like to feel validated, right? Now I'm gonna have to go fully.
I'm not crazy.
I'm not crazy. I'm not crazy. Look, yeah. I know what's actually going on. No, that's a good one to have, right? I'm interested to see where that research goes. I get definitely. I mean, we're like you said, we're going to see more and more attacks in that space. I mean, you've already seen what James Kettle and the Portswigger team can do with that, and that feels like the initial foray into this kind of HTTP fuzzing, request smuggling, cache poisoning, all those sorts of attacks that have been theoretical for so long are starting to be exploited. So, cool. Well, good. So use that, and we'll move on to the next article in our list for today. Did you want to talk about the InfoSec culture on Twitter, or did you want to talk about authentication?
No. That's the other last thing that kind of wrapping things up in a nice little bow here. You and I talked about specifically, so beyond the breach fatigue bit, we talked about the fact that, there's not a lot of details that come out. We wish there would be more details that emerge from these breaches. That way there's a little bit, for one, it's always nice that so I've just taken our straight up, always discussed, always mentioned insecure direct object reference, or IDOR vulnerability that, frequently crops up when there are actually details of a breach. We see it's usually something along those lines, or an RC or something like that. But it's helpful because for many reasons. One, to dissect, hey, yes, if this happened to them, then maybe our systems are vulnerable, so we'll go secure that. Also, if it's reported through one bug bounty program, sometimes people submit it through other bug bounty programs. It's helpful to kind of have that awareness. I know it's that's kind of separate from the breach conversation, right? That's just that awareness, I guess. It's the same thing. I guess what I'm trying to say is, and I'm rambling, it's the same thing as when you see another bounty program and it's been disclosed. Some vulnerability has been disclosed and you're like, okay, well, this is probably coming my way. Let me look at the details of how they handled it. That's usually helpful. It's similar with a breach, right? Where you kind of tying this all together. When you see a breach and the details, you can act accordingly as an internal defender. But there are other reasons that are helpful too. Like when we talk about case studies, we like to point to real events that occurred. And I think it's helpful with building awareness docs, like the top 10. I don't know how much those actually factor into the data that they're collecting. I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's a number of reasons, and we could probably find a million other little reasons for why this is useful. However, I like this talk because or the idea of the talk, which is, if I can post this link here, it is about how zero tolerance and the InfoSec council culture is hurting industry growth. And I know that's a mouthful, and there's a lot to unpack there. In this case, what they're saying is when people are breached, it isn't reported, or if it is reported, details are omitted, oftentimes just because of a sense of shame. For sure, I'm not going to name who I talked to this morning, but they had suffered a breach at one point, and we were talking back and forth via private messages about the experience of that, and how there's a stigma or there can be a stigma associated with having worked on a team that has been breached. I don't think in the circles that I'm running in currently, which is more, modern development culture, modern security culture, it's as prevalent of an issue. But I do think that there's a great, you deal with the industry as a whole, not just you specifically, Seth. You deal with intersections of all kinds of different cultures. So I think in the other realms or the other cultures that I'm not running into, they're probably feeling a bit of that. You're probably seeing some like the shame bell being rung. But yeah, I don't know. I just thought it was an interesting awareness conversation.
It definitely is, right? And you and I have talked a fair bit about this, how we used to use Twitter as a kind of feed of research, security research in general, and how that's gone away in the last 3-5 years. And I think this is part of the reason is uh, that the whole idea of the cancel culture, like once you're involved in a breach, no one will ever listen to like any of the research you ever do. And then we also have people that don't feel like they want to get involved or interact with the community because either they've been involved or they need to keep that stuff secret, or maybe the companies in and of themselves don't want to be in the news. And so it is stifling to what's going on. And we still see this, right? Like, especially with SolarWinds. And she, like, the lady that gave this talk at Black Hat EU was working through the SolarWinds response in the community and how everyone has a tendency, especially on Twitter and some of these social media apps, to jump in and almost lay blame and point fingers. And it's a little bit of schadenfreude of you got breached, but only after they make sure they look around and they're like, hey, were we one of those that were in the compromise, right? Like I always think back, It was a number of years ago, grifter Neil, he's big in the Black Hat DEF CON communities, like one of the organizers. He gave a talk about this probably 4 or 5 years ago as well. After one of the big breaches, he was just talking about the security trends in general. And that's the response that we often see is the whole, are we good? Are we good? Okay, now we're going to jump on the bandwagon, just blame you guys for not having good security practices, right? And it's almost that, like we cast aspersions on others when our own backyard is dirtier than anything else, right? It's, I mean, some of the most poorly written tools that are out there, insecure tools, are security tools written by the security industry in general, right?
Andrew Wilson has been talking about that for 12 years at least, since I've known him.
And he's absolutely
Andrew,
right.
He's on. Yeah, sure. I just wanted to point out he has been on the podcast. So if you want, you can Google it, YouTube it.
Yeah,
absolutely.
YouTube
Andrew Wilson.
Yep, and then he's very active in. He's down in Phoenix, like Cactus Con, right? Is his baby, but that's, I mean, that's just it, right? If you want to see some examples of security vulnerabilities, like go look at code from some of those open source projects that were developed with good intentions, and then the security people got sidetracked on other things and aren't supporting it anymore, and now it's vulnerable to everything in the sun because they just haven't had the time. So it's kind of hard to dig in that much or to take them seriously when they do cancel other people for the same thing that everybody's vulnerable to. There's just not a lot of empathy there, I guess, is what I'm getting at. I know there is on our side because we've been in both of those situations where we've been on teams when a compromise happens or a breach happens. Hey, what do you actually do? How do you work your way through that? The amount of just stress and I don't know, work that's involved with that is incredibly difficult. And so to pile on after the fact and have to defend yourself in a social media environment just feels cruel and unusual. Right?
Well, as part of my role, I have to talk to a lot of people who are, for one reason or another interviewing or, otherwise like coming from somewhere else. And when I talk to them, it's amazing. A lot of the things I thought, well, that's the old way. Everybody's evolved and learned, by now that these are mistakes and we don't do these things, like shaming people or whatever, and you think it's common sense, but common sense is built on common knowledge. And the more I talk to people, the less common knowledge, or the less I feel there is that common knowledge of some of the things that are, I just assumed those were issues of the past, but they're not. They're still issues of today for some people. So it's interesting. And the more people I talk to, the more I'm just like, wait, the broader industry still has a ways to go. Like before they're caught up to, some of them, like, I don't know how to say it, leading AppSec security groups. I don't know. Again, I don't know how to phrase that. Sometimes I use the word modern, but yeah, there's a lot of catching up to do out there.
Yeah. Yeah, there is. And I think it's also an indication of how much the industry has grown, right? Okay. We have people that aren't necessarily, or they haven't been in the industry as long, right? And it is, and to be fair, it is interesting to see what happens to these organizations and why they get breached. But it's the response that we have at times is somewhat childish. That's all I was trying to get at there. And I think that's what the speaker here is talking about as well. This whole idea of the cancel culture, that if you've been involved in a breach, you have no right to touch a computer from a security perspective ever again. When in fact, we should flip that script and say, man, you were involved in that breach. Those lessons that you learned during that probably make you a more valuable asset than anything else. And this is also why I don't like the idea of the CISO being the scapegoat in these situations. Like that leader role and that person probably had nothing to do with why that breach actually happened. And to cut them loose means you are cutting loose organizational knowledge about how to prevent this in the future, right? Like large organizations in general, there's so much institutional knowledge that goes into how they work. Cutting loose the one guy that actually understands the security culture in an organization means that you're cutting loose all of that knowledge that could be used in the future to prevent it from happening again. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, though. We're spinning into organizational mechanics, but that's where the podcast goes sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the unfortunate truth about leadership is that even if it's not directly your fault, you're going to be responsible for it if you're at the highest level.
Yeah.
And
I get that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And that's why I think it's important. And I mention this in many places, but I think I think you could, can you see that? There's a Tribe of Hackers book behind me. I'm in one of those chapters, and in there talk specifically about being careful about where you go. I think I do. I'm pretty sure. And there's a reason for that, because you do have to be careful where you go. So if you're going to be a CISO, you do have to be careful that where you're going, there's a healthy, believe it or not, healthy development community inside your organization, if you're doing what we do anyways. And if your business is, okay, I should walk that back. If you're not, it depends on your business model. But let's say you're a e-commerce type company, right? Yeah, you want to make sure that you have good development culture. If you're whatever you're going to need to be successful in your role, you want to make sure that the organization has a healthy culture, regardless. And I don't know. I could spend the entire rest of the episode explaining and breaking that down, but I think that's that. I just want to keep it at that, like a summary of just be careful where you go. It will impact what you're able to do and how badly you'll be burned if things go wrong.
Yeah, especially in those leadership roles, right?
Right.
Yeah,
that's what I'm explicitly talking about, though I do think that it's important for anyone, but yeah, especially for executive level leadership.
Yeah. I mean, I know we could get into a whole Yeah. I'm sure we can get into a whole discussion on that. Right. It might be interesting to pull somebody in that's actually in that type of a role and talk to them about the things that they have seen. Right. Like, anyway. So some of those past guests that we've had on that have discussed being in a security leadership role, whether that is CISO or something along those lines, have a lot of opinions about what they see and how do they try to build out a security culture and how much the organization itself impacts what they're able to do. But going back to it, right, like I do feel like it's naive to just pull that trigger and fire the CISO the first time a breach happens with some of the other things that go along. But on the flip side, if that's how your organization is, that's what you've got to be expecting when you step into it. Like that's why you want to vet the company as well as them vetting you before you actually hire on. Cool. Yeah, well, I think that's enough on that topic for today, Ken. Just because I think I definitely think we could go into it more, but I did want to bring up this user authentication article before we jump into one of the others here.
Okay.
Mainly because I see failures in user authentication in every single application that we test. Every single one. I don't think I've ever run into an application in the last 5 years that hasn't had an authentication problem. And part of this is a misunderstanding of, how do I want to say this? Part of this is a misunderstanding as far as what user authentication entails and what authentication actually is. And again, I go back to the crocs and socks of application security, right? I go back to AAA, like authentication, authorization, auditing. These are my favorite topics. If you ever get into a class with me, we will talk about AAA. Anyway, so authentication, identification of users. How the application identifies a user and confirms who they are is so critical to security functionality that it's a much more complex topic than just username and password. And this blog is a good list of everything that you have to think about, but there is no solution there, right? He just says, wow, it sounds like it's really simple. You're authenticating a person, you're identifying who they are, but all the different nuances that go into that, depending on your application, make it an extremely difficult topic. And I know, Ken, you guys deal with this from a GitHub perspective because of all the tokens that are used, because of all the avenues that people have to get access to code, that it's just a hard problem to solve across the board, right? I mean, I start thinking about the GitHub authentication, right? Everything from SSH to HTTP to, and then you start throwing in 2FA, you start throwing in, okay, you've got like code spaces, you got all the different web services and this is just looking at it from an outside perspective, not internally what you guys are actually dealing with.
It's a very difficult problem. I mean, or not problem, but it's very difficult to get right. We have many ways of identifying people and then coupling that with authorization internally. I'll say this. So we did, because of the complexity, and if you have this level of complexity, we created a testing matrix for unit tests. And the matrix covers all the different scenarios that can go wrong. And then you can easily just reuse that for whatever you're building. So if you're building an endpoint, you can reuse this testing matrix to make sure that the weird, buggy stuff that we've seen before isn't a problem. That's incredibly helpful. So that's my first recommendation. But also, it's interesting. They mentioned Springs, like it should just be easy to drag in a solution. Like they mentioned Spring Security in the article. One thing you and I cover a lot is devise in our course with Rails. And we show how there's the configuration files for devise it has, so it's actually multiple parts of that. So there's the configuration file itself for device, which can be really, there's a lot of options. In fact, a lot of these checklist items they mention are actually covered inside of that configuration, like whether you're going to allow magic links, or whether you're going to allow people to not verify their email address and log in. There's lots of, and verified emails being useful for like 2FA or MFA. So there's a lot of variables that can be changed to the configuration file. Then on top of that, if you actually want to introduce something like some password complexity, for instance, you actually have to override, typically at the model layer for device specifically. They have different strategies you can pull in at the model layer for, let's say you're using a user class or user model for all your users who you're authenticating. That's where you would make those additions. And then inside of those, whatever strategies you've chosen, you then can override them. And that's how you would override to actually implement password, or that's where you would override to implement password complexity stuff. So you've got the model layer, and then you've got the configuration. And then there's also like, you can override the controllers and the views, and those provide you additional ways to extend security. So realistically, even a simple solution, a library that you're pulling in that's supposed to do all this for you, still has many ways that it can go wrong, many ways that it can be configured in many places inside of an application. And again, I know we talk about that in our course.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite, right, like that we talk about all the time, is the use of the secret key for token generation, right? And the fact that everybody just clones a project and reuses that token, the same token value that's in that base project over and over, even though there's warnings in the configuration file that says, change this before you use it. Yeah, everybody still uses it, right? And like that gives attackers the ability to predict what tokens are going to be. Well, maybe not predict, but at least generate tokens that are valid for that system. I mean, and that's where we run into problems with RCE and other things when we're doing deserialization, if they are using serialized objects as tokens. But like just that kind of base level.
Failing open too, where they call like everybody's calling the same environment variable to sign for different crypto operations, which we all know should be a different key per crypto operation, meaning if I'm doing session generation, that's one key. If I'm doing webhook HMAC validation, that's another key, right? That's what I mean by that. And people will reuse the same key, but then also fail open. So if that key doesn't exist as an environment variable, it'll just default to an empty string to generate those things. And like that happens all the time, where like variables don't make it into prod for one reason or another. The environment variables don't get pushed. So now you're failing open instead of saying like, here's an exception, stop running the app. Like these secrets aren't there. So yeah, anyways, that's just one more additional crazy thing that can happen and does happen.
Well, I mean, we talked through this quite a bit, right? Like the looking for what can go wrong, thinking about what can go wrong from an authentication perspective. Like that's one of the pillars of our course, right? Is this idea of performing a threat model on your application from different perspectives. And this is one of those that we know that we have a checklist, right? So this is a good checklist of things that can go wrong, but you've got to think about your application from that perspective of how, what is it that I'm pulling in? What are those libraries? How are we identifying users? How are those cookies being generated? Like one that I just recently saw, I mean, just yesterday, I'm testing a mobile application, right? And they're like, oh, this is great, right? Like we're going to store the username and password in the keychain, or in the key store, protected in iOS and Android. And then, okay, that's great. But then I go look in the preference file and they're like storing the session token in plain text in the preferences files, like, that are getting backed up. I'm like, guys, right? Like it's great that you protected the username and password, but again, this is an authentication failure that we didn't recognize what is the most common token that is being used to authenticate users. It's not username and password, it's the actual session token that's generated upon authentication, upon login. And that's not protected. So somebody just has to pick that out of that file and drop it into their browser or their application, and they have access to your whole account. And this is an extremely common problem that I see. This is why I say we see these issues with every single application that we test. Yes, authentication is a broad topic. I get that. But we fall down in how we authenticate users. Sometimes it's not as critical as that. Sometimes we don't have complete account takeover because of authentication failures. But it's still something that's got to be thought about. It's something that you should test. And I end up spending way more time on it than I expected going into most assessments.
In that checklist that you posted, the first thing is like, how is cookie security being handled, which is the same thing as what you're talking about, sessions being stored in preference. So yeah. So pretty
JWTs, right? JWTs introduce almost more problems, or they generate more problems than they're worth. Like I'm sure we could have a whole session just ripping on JWTs again if you wanted to, Ken.
Yeah, I got to change shirts though. I got to get my JWT hate. Yeah, no. To be clear, it's just about when it's being used as a drop-in replacement for cookies and browsers that it's an issue in my mind. But in any case, authentication's hard. It remains hard. And
anybody that tells you that it's easy is lying. That's just they are. Just use this library. It's going to solve all your problems. It's not going to. So
you still have to have somebody behind it helping to implement it properly and securely. That's for sure.
Yep. Cool. Okay, so that's authentication for today. My little rant, I guess, for this episode of the podcast. Let's see. We've
got tons of other stuff, so it doesn't really. I think we.
Which one did you? Which topic do you want to talk about now?
I don't know, man. I mean, they're all pretty good. I'm looking through here. Well, actually, and on that note, while we're choosing, if anybody has questions that they want to ask us, feel free to drop those in chat, either on the YouTube link or in Slack, or email us at info@absoluteappsec.com. We're always looking for topics, for speakers. We could always do a Q&A session. I know one thing we're looking towards doing, this is outside of what I'm bringing up, we are going to do some nights where we hang out with y'all and stream us picking a random app, or someone giving us a random app, rather one of the viewers choosing some random app and then us doing a code review and scratching our heads live and fumbling live and otherwise making probably self-deprecating jokes, and should be a good time. But just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, we need to pick a date for that. Speaking of which, Ken, we'll do that today, and then we'll post it on Twitter and in the Slack channel so we can have people start to give us some input there. It'll probably be within the next couple of weeks, actually. As things slow down for the holiday season, we'll play with it. And then Derek B did just have a question about string eval. I probably need more information on that to figure it out, but I think it is just the API key. That's a way to pass it around as a token value or as a parameter. Yeah. Anyway, jump into Slack. We probably don't. Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like it's just passing the key into a base 64 op, so it can normalize that content for putting it into the HTTP request.
Cool. Then let's see.
Just because usually in those authorization headers, it is usually in the authorization header specifically, the value is usually base 64 encoded. So I don't think it's an eval. I think it's actually just in calling that function and providing a string, it looks like.
Yeah. Well, actually, I want to get into as well, now that I'm thinking about it, let's talk about Chrome. And that article that you found on, it's called Firefox is the only alternative.
Yeah, let me I got the link now. Cool. I'll put that in chats, plural. So there's this chat, and I'll put it in the Slack as well. But in it,
you just copied the wrong one.
Oh, of course I did. Yeah, it's really weird. Whenever speaking of browser stuff and client apps and things like that, it's funny that whenever I use video chat and Slack together, it gets pretty weird. It gets pretty difficult to use. All right, so this should be the right one. Firefox is the only alternative. There we go. Okay. Sorry for the what? All right, that came out.
That got it.
Cool.
Yep.
So weird, so frustrating, man. Trying to get these links right. Anyways, you would think, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean it is, right. Like it's just. Do you computer much, right? Like, yeah.
I know. I feel like an idiot, but it is what it is. It's just.
It's okay.
What were you gonna say?
No, I was gonna start diving in. So I was gonna date myself, right? Like, back when I started using computers, there was two options for browsers, right? There was IE, and there was, well, even then it was Mozilla. It was Netscape before it became Mozilla, before it became Firefox, right? But Netscape and IE, Internet Explorer, were the two behemoths that were out there, and everyone developed to those browsers. And we ran into a condition where Netscape started to go away, and it caused all sorts of, I don't know, trepidation in the industry, because we were moving towards kind of a single entity that controlled the web, right? That was the whole fear. And this article is almost indicative of the same thing going on, but based on Chrome as opposed to IE, which was back in the day the most popular browser because it came on everybody's computer. That's what people associated with the internet, was the E icon. And I don't know if we've gotten away from that. And there could be some argument as well because of mobile, because of mobile devices, mobile applications, just kind of the splintering of how we interact with the web, that it's no longer the case. But Chromium, and this is what the article does, is it makes this argument that most browsers nowadays are built on top of Chromium, which is the open source project that is used to render content for Chrome, Safari, right? What else, right? Like everything else that's out there, Burp Suite, right? Edge, like they're all of these browsers are using the same engine behind the scenes, and it introduces it introduces a number of vulnerabilities and issues that could potentially be problems in the future, right? Anyway, like, what was your thoughts on that? Like, why did it pique your interest to bring it up today?
Yeah, even Electron's using Chromium, No, it interests. I guess there's a few reasons why it would be interesting. So one thing, okay, let's just start systematically. So there was a point made that in that article that it really does come down to, at this point, Chrome or Firefox, and they kind of said that you have to look at Safari as not really being a competitor. They give some reasons why, but one thing I wanted to pinpoint there was the comment about Safari typically kind of building things for their, building when they interact with folks to build web standards. It's primarily to drive their own view of how the web should work and their own standards. I'm not saying this. I'm just saying this is what the article mentions. I will say I've heard that sentiment many times over my time at where I currently work, that it can be difficult during some of these working groups, where essentially there's mostly an agreement on things, and then the Apple will kind of come in at times and have some influence. This is not to say that they're it's not to be I need to tread lightly here, but what I'm trying to say while I'm trying to tread lightly is that there are reasons that that someone might have to drive their own standards in how the web works, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And if you're motivated by that, it makes it hard to consider it a open standard. It's more of like, corporate influence to an open standard for the benefit of a specific entity without the benefit of the whole being at the forefront there. That's the light. That's the light step I'll take there with that. But or the me treading lightly there. Okay, with that in mind, that means now, and again, the technology itself speaks for the argument there. But anyways, so going back to Chrome and Firefox, I think it's interesting because Firefox used to be my default testing browser, and over time, Chrome had kind of like picked up, and become the thing where it just like websites worked. For one, that was a big thing. But I agree that another point raised was that there's really, it's going to be not a monopoly but a duopoly with just Firefox and Chrome, which is probably true. I think that Firefox. One point they made was that Firefox contributes a lot to web standards, but also they put a lot of emphasis on protecting the end user, and so it's a necessary thing to have a consortium like that helping drive standards. So those are the few points I thought were interesting. Something else that's completely ancillary and like it's kind of like just a random thought, more so than a fully fledged one, was just, yesterday we were talking about how something silly. It was just talking about how like SVGs work with image tags, right? Pretty easy to suss out that, if you're embedding an SVG via image tag, not really any XSS going to occur there, right? Like you'd have to navigate to the SVG to then have scripts, meaning like browsers aren't just going to like execute any scripts in an SVG if it's embedded via an image tag, right? In modern browsers. However, and I would assume that email clients work the same. And then I started thinking about, well, how are email clients written? Are they Chromium based, Electron, which is Chromium based? Like, what are they written in? And so it started bringing up some more thoughts about like, oh, well, are those standards matching up like email clients with, web browsers? And like, because, it was like, well, how could you introduce XSS if not through a browser, like using image tags with an SVG? And I guess it's just interesting because, it makes you think like, hey, how many clients of desktop apps that we assume are, like it's just a desktop app, are actually running they're running the same browsers basically under the hood, right? I mean, there's the same kind of standards they should be but is it interacting the same? Not in a lot of cases, or not. I don't know now, but yeah. Now I feel like I'm rambling, but does that make any sense what I'm saying there?
No,
how
it does.
And browsers may have different behavior, but they may not, just because they may be using the same underlying technology.
It does, because we used to run into this all the time. I'm going back to like these mobile tests that I've been doing. Like we've been getting a lot of them in recently, but that's one of the things that we look for is embedded browser use, right? Because you can interact directly with the browser, like the WebKit API in iOS or on Android or Chromium, like whatever it is on either of those platforms. And you don't have to implement everything that Safari or Chrome actually does. You can just render the content and then display pages and allow for hyperlinking and everything else. Like you can abuse some of those applications to use them as browsers, even though that's unintended use. But along with that cross-site scripting becomes an issue, especially with React Native applications or JavaScript applications or Electron applications that you're running, because you're embedding HTML content within the application itself, and then you're interacting with the web like a browser would, but without all of the protections that the browser developers have put into it. So you're absolutely right. Like it's an issue across the board, because we've become so heavily dependent on the rendering of HTML and the use of the dynamic web in these products that probably don't necessarily need dynamic web and don't need that browser rendering, but it's really easy to drop that into place. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
It is.
I'm with you. I'm with you there, right? Is basically what I'm saying. I don't know. I always find it interesting that we've become so heavily dependent on Google for the browser when everyone was up in arms, that period 2002 to 2004, maybe down to like 2007, 8, like everybody was so anti Microsoft because of IE, right? Oh, they've got ActiveX. Oh, they've got all these technologies they made that they built into the browser to make it easy for people to use it. And now we trust Google with the same power, but we don't really talk about it, right? It's like, oh, it's a non-issue because Google's, because their motto is "Don't be evil." We can trust them, right? Like and then Google complains that Apple is making these unreasonable requests to put standards in that are advantageous to Apple, but Google's doing the same thing in Chrome, right? Like, what's the default search engine for Chrome? It's Google, right? Like, you have to specifically go in and change it if you want to use something else. Yeah, that is an advantage that Google has because they're providing this Chromium browser to everyone. It feels strange to me, but I'm guilty of it as well, right? I use Chrome for pretty much everything, and then like them embedding Chromium into Burp Suite means I use it even more. I will flip to Firefox for testing at times, but nowadays I'm just able to open that up and run, and it makes my life easier. So guess what? We stick with Chrome for most things.
Because I used to use Firefox because over Chrome, because Firefox actually allowed my XSS payloads to execute. Yeah. So for the longest time, I was like, I'll use Firefox because Chrome's doing too good of a job of preventing it. So
yeah.
But now, with it being built into Burp Suite, it's less of a concern. So I don't tend to use it anymore. But I'm like, yeah, I should. It's just I'm pretty dependent on one company at this point, and they have all my data, and it's been proven that data is not always used for the greatest purposes. So it's definitely an article that made me think about a lot of different things. That's why I bring it up. It seems on the surface, it's like, oh yeah, well, okay, Chrome and Firefox are the big players. Yeah, we get it. Like, that's what's news about that. But I think the points raised and the sort of the future landscape that was discussed and the points brought up, I just overall, it spurred a lot of thought for like a 8 o'clock in the morning read, So
yeah. No, and it is really interesting, like the breakdown that he does in the article on what the market share is, right?
Right.
And Firefox is only 4% or less than that of the actual traffic that we're seeing on a daily basis, which is somewhat discouraging, but yeah, it was 32% at one point, right? And it's fallen that much. Yeah. And I don't know how much of that is related to kind of this mobile shift that's happened as well. I think that's where Safari's had an advantage. And I know I'm getting into like nuances and I'm just speculating here. So, you can feel free to interrupt me and like tell me I'm full of crap, because that works too. I don't know though, right? Like I'm trying to think, because I haven't had. It used to be that you would find sites that wouldn't work with specific browsers, right? I always
absolutely.
I always like to say, if you're still using Internet Explorer, you kind of get what you deserve in today's web, right? Obviously, it's not going to support the later technologies or even the later security configurations and parameters. So, yeah, not a lot of people are using IE, just based on what we're seeing here, if anyone is, and if it's usually internal to some good legacy company that has legacy apps that have to be used internally. Okay, whatever, let's leave that aside. But I can't remember the last time that I really used Firefox in a daily work environment, right? Or just browsing the web environment. Even though it's installed everywhere, and again, I'm as guilty as you are, as anybody else is, that I'm pretty sure that it's probably even out of date, to be honest with you, right? The version that I'm running, because we know that those browsers get updated on a pretty frequent basis, pretty regular basis. And But to your point, right? Like, okay, I'm trusting Google with my view into the internet. I'm also trusting Google with email. I'm trusting Google with, calendaring, trusting
Yeah.
Google with, like these organizational
Payments,
things,
phone
payments.
calls.
Mhm.
I don't know if you're using Google Voice. That's a service they offer.
Yeah. And so at some point we've become overly dependent on, again, one company, just like we were with Microsoft back in the day. But all of the complaints that you see nowadays when it comes to, oh, there's large organizations that, control the internet. Facebook is the one that gets all the hate, right? Just like Microsoft back in the day, it's now Meta, whatever, right? Facebook gets all the hate because of everything that's gone on with that platform, and it's more obvious. Whereas we've got Google or Alphabet that actually controls probably more of the internet than Facebook ever has or ever will, to be honest.
It's actually funny. Man, speaking of Meta, so many people have kind of shit on that like idea and like made a lot of jokes and just been really a lot of just kind of like haha, all that. I think it's really short sighted of people. I think people should realize like AR is here, VR is here. You know, I mean, if you think people are on their phones a lot, imagine once they can interact more in a more featureful way with virtual environments. This is going to just keep growing. And I mean, right now it's like 3D picture. Well, what if we add in temperature controlled suits and smells and things like that that make it feel more real? Um, what happens then? People are going to spend a lot of time in that virtual environment. I think that they're just trying to get ahead of that. And um, it's, to me, the people that are silly are the ones that are mocking it, because I think you have to understand that yeah, long term, they're making a play towards the long term, and I think that they're
Mhm.
doing. I think it's intelligent, to be honest with you. As much as people mock it, I actually think it's really smart. If I
Yeah.
was in his shoes, in that company's shoes, but if I was Mark Zuckerberg, that would be space I'd be trying to, because they already have, like, to the point of what we've been talking about, a huge user base. They're already positioned for this. They already have your data. They already have you hooked into their ecosystem. And now they're just to expand that ecosystem and build off that power instead of just being a social networking site. So in the long run, a lot of ha-has right now, but wait 5 or 10 years. I wonder what it'll look like.
Well, and so going back to this article, this is exactly what happened with Google, right? They realized as a search engine, yes, they had all this data, they had what people were searching for, but they didn't control the user's interactions with the web or with the internet. And so what did they do? They went out, they built Chrome, they open sourced it, they put all of this energy into the interface that people are using to interact with the web. And 10 years, 15 years later, they now are this huge monopoly of, okay, everyone uses us because it's the easy way to get into things, and they can manipulate. Um, yeah, I mean, they can control that interface and what people see and what people do on the web because of that foresight that they had 10 years ago. And so, yeah, Meta, I mean, honestly, right? Like you and I have both played with the Oculus. We've used it. It's pretty awesome, right? Like
Yeah.
there's no getting
And,
around
and,
it.
and I messed with Unity to build some of that. And man, it's it is pretty sweet what they've done. They make it easy to get onboarded as a developer. And I'm not like I'll be just straight up honest. And these are my own opinions. I think I have to say that now. These are my
Yeah.
opinions. I don't express it for anyone else. I don't care for Facebook much. I don't. But however, now that I'm seeing this expansion and this sort of like future state, man, it's exciting to see what Meta is doing there. So um, to your point,
Yeah.
though, they have you hooked into an ecosystem. Leverage it. You're right.
Yeah.
That's exactly what Google did. They started with the search engine and they blown up from there. So
Yeah.
yeah, man,
Yep.
I don't think it's unrealistic to say, in a world where we're being pushed more remote and frankly at times a little bit more isolated, that this will be a way to connect with society in a different manner.
Yep.
So
Yep. Yeah. I mean, that's just it. Like I mean, it always starts with the games, like to kind of test out what it looks like. And, but you'll see, I can't, eventually you're going to see Zoom or like Teams or Slack or some of these like communication portals move into the VR space because it's a natural progression, right? Hey,
Absolutely.
let's just pop that on and it'll give us face-to-face interactions again. I mean, not on a screen like this, but it'll feel more live, and it's going to happen. That's just it. You can't fault a company for trying to pop into that. So anyway, we took an interesting turn today after all that we've talked about.
Covered a lot.
But yeah, we did. We really did. Everything from cancel culture to browser wars to authentication and how hard it is. But
I think we've solved nothing today. I hope everyone got
No.
enjoyment out of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Oops, sorry.
Oops. But watch for the announcement as far as our upcoming live code review show as Ken and I drink and look at code. It's going to be a good time. And yeah, but otherwise, join us next week. We'll have other topics to run through. We're excited to keep at it, join the conversation, jump into Slack, hit us up on Twitter at Absolute AppSec or at Seth Law or at CK Tricky. We love to talk about this stuff. But for sure, join the Absolute AppSec Slack channel. There's a lot of good people in there and a lot of good conversation that happens. So yeah, otherwise, Ken, any last minute thoughts before we close it out for this week?
Nope, just appreciate the love and the viewership. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for giving us your time. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.